Well, I thought we would spend some time this morning talking about macro events as it relates to our global economy that we are all dealing with and facing, both individually, in our communities, in our countries, in our local economies, and most importantly, especially on a day like today, globally. And the thought is that while we have some slides that we can go through in detail, I wanted to spend the first part of the discussion really just speaking to you at a high level around, from an anecdotal standpoint, what we are seeing around the globe as it relates to market economies and their impacts on all of us, and then to go more deeply into some of the data and trends that are driving these various factors. We'll have about an hour together, 45 minutes of remarks, both in terms of me speaking to you directly, as well as sharing some important key slides. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions as well. When we think about the global economy and where we are from the standpoint of growth, and more importantly, as it relates to a pandemic, I'm often reminded of the quote by Mark Twain. "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So much of what we see today is the function and the result of expectations matched against a brutal reality, whether it's COVID-19 or the overall pullback of the economy in light of the pandemic, the then resounding rebound that we saw as a result of the pandemic abating, potentially due to warmer temperatures, only to then return. And if that's not enough, elections both in the US as well as the various Brexit consternation that we've all been dealing with for a number of years. There's so many items we could talk about, and the list goes on and on. But just to start first with the pandemic in terms of how we think about as it rates. Earlier this year, as many of you are aware, there was a very critical US election which took place. And at the time, the saying went that the US election pales, or earnings, I should say, corporate earnings for Q3 pales in relation to the US election. But the reality, as the virus or the beast, as it sometimes is referred by scientists, the beast, unfortunately, is the real front and center issue that we're all dealing with. And that, in many ways, pales in relation to the US election. As a result, the election largely went off, and we'll talk more about in more detail, but it largely went off in a much more orderly way than many prognosticators had feared. But really, it's the virus that's taken control, both on the downside as well as more recently on the upside, with promising news out of Pfizer and Moderna in terms of their trials and the results of those trials, which we'll also talk more about. So let me just share with you some high-level thoughts, and then we'll go into the actual materials in a little bit. In terms of where we sit here today, we currently have over 55 million cases of infections worldwide of COVID-19, 1.3 million fatalities, leading to a fatality rate of 2.41%. In the US, we are very much in what scientists are referring to as the third wave of the pandemic, with the first wave really being in March and April, the second wave in the US being in the southern states, and now the third wave. And if we look at the R0, or the degree of infectability from one case to another, we're currently at a level of 1.2, when the goal is to be well below 1 in all 48 continuous states within the United States. Turning to Europe, the cases unfortunately have been raging and are equally severe, where we've seen new highs in countries like Spain and Italy and France as they work to really fight the pandemic. And countries and economies such as the UK in particular have been truly obliterated as they've worked to enforce stronger lockdowns. Yet miraculously, while we're seeing such issues in places like the US and Europe, China has managed to really move through the virus in terms of where they are from the cycle. And their economy is largely operating in an environment almost near pre-pandemic levels, which really speaks to the dichotomous way in which people respond, both in terms of the government policies in place, individual freedoms and responsibilities, and the way in which individuals respond to the virus. I'm reminded most notably of the UK, where in the UK, there was a particular focus to basically keep things on lockdown for longer, really to the July 4th date, or early July date, which is now being viewed as a major reason why the UK economy has contracted so much more severely than other parts of Europe or the US. Taking a step back from a financial markets perspective, we saw an unbelievable collapse of financial markets in March and April as the virus began to truly take hold, with the S&P 500 declining over 34% from peak to trough. Importantly, if you think of that decline relative to historical declines, if we look back to the Great Recession of 2008, the last time the US economy was really focused on this type of a decline, what we saw was a move down that was equally severe relative to where we sit currently today. And so from the standpoint of the overall economy in terms of that decline, it was only then met, and again, the Mark Twain quote is so significant here and makes so much sense, because it was only then met by a resounding rebound in terms of that market decline, which led to the rebound that we saw in the global economy, where from just a price standpoint, that 34% decline was followed by a 59% rebound of global stocks. Most people investors were completely caught off guard in relation to that recovery that we saw as a result of that decline, which was largely the result of movements by not so much the underlying populace, but really central banks, whether it's the ECB, the Bank of England, or the US Federal Reserve Bank. The degree to which these banks stepped in and supported the overall economic fundamental structures of the various economies is really unmatched, unheralded, and unparalleled relative to history. If you look back to the Great Recession of 2008, while we saw central banks step in and provide support for what was happening in the overall economy, it was a much more of a grinding slow, the gears of government and business working together in much more of a moderated and slowed fashion relative to where we are today. Yet as we sit here in this current environment, the Fed really pulled out all of the stops in relation to trying to provide its necessary tools to get us to where we are today. And as a result of those tools being deployed as quickly, swiftly, and more importantly, effectively relative to past and history, what we saw was a tremendous rebound in the economy and in markets as a result of this. Just to give you a little bit of an example, historically, the Federal Reserve Bank has never supported credit markets before. It's never moved in and provided an opportunity to essentially not only support the overall fundamentals of liquidity, but also to literally go as far as to say, if you are a corporation and your debt status were to be downgraded from what's referred to as investment grade to junk status, which would be a level below BBB minus from a rating standpoint, we, the Fed, will step in and buy your bonds. This has been unprecedented. And as a result, whether you're Carnival Cruise Lines or American Airlines, these businesses in the travel and leisure sector or in the other industries such as food service that were hit so hard by the overall economy were able to rebound as a result of that tremendous move. And as a result, companies moved to take tremendous advantage of the unprecedented levels of liquidity that were available to them. It's unbelievable to think that Carnival Cruise Lines has been able to raise debt at only 5% in terms over LIBOR relative to history, when his business was largely decimated as a result of this unknown virus, which again brings us back to that Mark Twain quote. It's not something any of us could have anticipated. Equally so has been the tremendous proliferation of technology stocks, most notably Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. These businesses, not only did they not experience the tremendous decline of 34% in the first part of the pandemic, but they are up on a year-to-date basis over 59% relative to their pre-2020 levels. And this tremendous appreciation has largely been the result of the resilience of their business models, and more importantly, the way in which investors have gravitated to their business models as a result of the pandemic, looking no further than our platform here today, presenting to all of you on Microsoft Teams. And so as a result, when we think about the effect that these technology businesses have had, we're reminded of a thought by one of the famous economists from Austria, Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter did not coin the term, but certainly popularized the term creative destruction. Creative destruction is really the destructibility or the decomposition by the capitalistic system of one process to allow for the creation of another. And so much can be said for the innovation which springs eternal as a result of the moves that companies make as they try to take the technological pieces and put them together to create a new normal or a new experience for investors. This has been true nowhere more so than what we've seen in the last year with the resilience, recovery, and technology that we've seen by these big, large businesses. As a result, technology companies now represent over 22% of the S&P 500 in terms of the stock market. And that move to have so much of the economy covered by those stocks has really been extraordinary in terms of its impact on investors. That 22% representation is higher than the 18% level of capitalization that we saw looking back to 2000 or to the previous technology bubble of 2000. But unlike the 2000 bubble, what we've seen is that these technology companies have tremendous earnings to actually support their market valuations. Even though the valuations are very high, in relation to history, these businesses are performing extraordinarily well relative to that history. And which brings us to another point, which is the point at which we see a reversion to the mean. Growth stocks have performed extraordinarily well relative to value stocks over this period of time. Yet through it all, what we've seen is in the growth of these growth stocks has been businesses in sectors such as oil services, the financial sector, and certainly any other service businesses have been truly decimated in their attempts to really try to regain customers in this environment. And so the path forward will largely be dependent upon the ability of the technology companies to maintain their grip, which few deny won't continue, coupled with the recovery of these other businesses. Most notably, the gap between growth stocks and value stocks, or the haves and have-nots, has never been higher in history. And that chasm will only narrow with the continued improvement of the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to having a vaccine, for which we've now importantly received great information about. The ability to have a COVID-19 vaccine has really been brought to the forefront in light of Pfizer as well as Moderna's trials. Just yesterday, Pfizer announced that they now have been following the over 50% of the participants in the phase 3 clinical trial for a minimum of 2 months, which was the minimum requirement set forth by the FDA, to essentially comment not on the efficacy of 90%, but now believed to be as high as 95%. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. You have to think back to the 1960s for the last time we had a vaccine that was brought online as quickly in the solving of the mumps crisis, which was 4 years. And so to have done this in such a short period of time will certainly benefit all of us. The question is, what will that path in terms of the recovery of the pandemic really be in terms of the disbursement of this vaccine? As I'm sure many of you have read, the Pfizer vaccine is one that requires to be stored at temperatures 95 degrees below Fahrenheit, which is an extraordinarily cold temperature. 2 doses of the vaccine must be received 28 days apart. It's a tremendous logistical exercise to be able to disperse this vaccine to the various populace. And so what is the framework and way in which that vaccine will be distributed, and what role will technology play in that distribution? Earliest indications from medical scientists as well as economists and those studying this suggest that it will be broken into 4 phases. At least that's how it will likely prevail. Phase 1 will occur as early as January and February, where the vaccine is given to frontline healthcare workers and those with multiple comorbidities. Phase 2 will start shortly thereafter in the February to March timeframe, where people with a single comorbidity will then be granted the virus, as well as other essential workers. Even the definition of essential workers has broadened out so significantly relative to where it was a number of years ago, with this including people like those who work at grocery stores and healthcare facility providers, not just in terms of caring for patients, but serving on the front lines with respect to customers. Phase 3 is likely to include small children as well as teachers, so that people that need to go to work can do so because their teachers will be supported, and that's likely anticipated in the April timeframe. And then finally, phase 4, which are those that are not expressing comorbidities, that don't have frontline healthcare worker responsibilities, that are not working in essential work, but are essentially in that age group where they're under age 65, over age 30, and they're largely healthy. I have to suspect that many of us on this call fall into that group, and it's just humbling to know what essential workers are doing on our behalf as we all sit comfortably in our own homes, serving our businesses, serving our customers, and serving our clients in various capacities. So with the vaccine surely put in a fashion that's growing in terms of its ultimate improvement relative to where we are, we can turn to what the growth forecasts look like for our business. And those growth forecasts are largely hinged upon the degree to which markets contracted in the first part and the early part of this year, their then resounding recovery, which has occurred later in the year, only to then be moved forward into 2021. What we saw from global markets was an unbelievable contraction in that first quarter, and in the second quarter in particular. But what was equally impressive was the degree to which businesses snap back. And one of the debates that economists are left to struggle with is, to what degree can we talk about this economy in relation to what's happened before in the earlier waves of the virus, realizing now that we're in this third wave. And what we saw was, as much as there was tremendous destruction of the economy in that first and second wave in the first quarter, there was a resounding improvement in that next period. And that gives us a certain degree of hope and comfort as it relates to what lies ahead for 2021 and the years beyond. Most notably, Goldman Sachs believes that the overall economy will grow by 6% in 2021, and that global growth will be divided up in terms of the major economies, with respect to the US having growth north of 5%. That growth largely is on the back of a 3% decline for 2020. We anticipate Euroland growth will also be in the 5% range, but having to deal with a 7% contraction this year. So on a net basis, over 2021 and 2020, we expect Euroland to still be down about 2.5%. The UK, as I highlighted earlier, due in large measure to having lockdowns occur for longer, coupled with the various consternation around Brexit, had a decline of 11%, which we believe will be met with a 5% recovery in 2021, leading to a net decline of about 6.5%, which is obviously extraordinary, both in terms of absolute terms as well as even in relative terms. In Japan, which has fared somewhere between China and Euroland in relation to its response to the virus, having dealt with various pandemics before, had a 2020 decline of 5%, then met by a 3% increase, looking at about a 2% decline. In terms of China, as I highlighted earlier, and we'll talk more deeply about this when we get to the slides, China really is going to manage to have a 2% positive return in 2020, which we think will be met by then a 7.5% increase in 2021, leading to a 9% overall growth rate. And so as we put all these economies together and think where we are, the scarring effects from the declines related to the pandemic, one thing is clear from an unemployment picture, is that unemployment, as severe and sharp as it's become in various places of the world, is largely been the result of temporary effects, with most workers furloughed as opposed to permanently laid off. And government programs have really stepped in, both in the US and abroad, to provide support for these workers, to allow for some basis of stability, much so that really didn't exist in times as recently as the Great Recession, or more notably at times such as the Great Depression. And really it's that combination of government and industry working together, both in terms of the results and movements of central banks, coupled with the ability of companies to continue to perform, which has allowed us to provide that recovery in terms of where we are. And so we anticipate that that is likely to persist and continue relative to history. Finally, turning to the US election before we get into some more of the details. As it relates to the US election, as we sit here today, Joe Biden is not only a presumptive winner, but is the named winner, having achieved a number of electoral votes of 290, which excludes Georgia. If we include Georgia in that total, which is 16 electoral votes, the election is still too close to call, with less than 10,000 votes separating President-elect Biden from current President Trump. Then Biden's win goes to 306 electoral votes relative to 232. What's really unbelievable and remarkable is that that electoral split is actually identical to that which was the inverse in the 2016 election, when President Trump surprisingly exceeded Hillary Clinton. And as we'll talk later in the presentation, the various degrees to which a Biden presidency will have implications on the world is really extraordinary, both in terms of its impact, but also equally important is the pivot back towards being a involved global partner as opposed to U.S. interests first, which Trump has clearly been a very large promoter of. Interestingly enough, from a popular vote standpoint, President-elect Biden is closing in on 6 million popular votes over President Trump. I know that it's difficult for our international partners to sometimes conceive how one person can win the popular vote, yet the other candidate can actually win the election based on the way in which our electoral system is set up, having electoral colleges in represented states, and those states all having certain votes that contribute to the total. Importantly, the market did breathe a sigh of relief, not so much in terms of the Biden win, but more so in the fact that it appears as though Congress will clearly be split relative to the presidential ticket. So at the presidential ticket, we're going to have a Democrat, and for the first time since 1884, Grover Cleveland in the US, that Democrat will take office for the first term without a Democratic-led Senate. So the diversion between the president sitting from a Democrat and the Senate, which has not yet been fully decided, which I'll explain more in a moment, is likely to be split. And that is a historical result. Without the Senate, the president will largely be hamstrung in terms of what they're able to get done by virtue of the fact that in Congress, you have the House of Representatives, where many bills are put forth, but then it goes to the Senate, which was described by our founders as ultimately the saucer dish that allows the tea which is overflown from the cup to prevent from heating. The Senate currently sits with 50 seats for Republicans and 48 for Democrat. There's a 2-seat gap, which is largely the result of 2 Georgia candidates not receiving over 50% of the vote. Georgia has a special rule which says that if a Senate candidate does not achieve at least 50% of the vote, then they must go to a runoff election. Early voting for that runoff election starts in mid-December, and the final votes will be tallied on January 5th, at which time we will know the composition of the Senate, which will then result in an outcome of where we stand. It is possible, though it's not currently suggested by the polls, that the Democrats could win those 2 seats into the Georgia runoff election, thereby having an equal 50-50 split between the Democrats and Republicans, in which case the vice president, in this case President-elect Harris, who was historic and made history in her own right as being the first woman, first African-American, and first Asian-American elected to the office in the United States, would potentially then break that tie-breaking vote. Even so, whether it's a 50-50 Senate or it's a Senate slightly controlled by the Republicans, the ability to push through significant legislative reform will be largely hampered as a result of the fact that there will be largely gridlock in Washington. As a result, as we'll detail a little bit later in the presentation, the focus will then be on what the president can do by virtue of executive order to be able to support their initiatives as it relates to this, as it relates to their path forward. So having talked about all of these issues, we can now move to the details of the slide deck. And if we can please turn to page 9. I wanted to share with you all the mobility data as it relates to where we are in the US. We've been using mobility data as a way to drive an understanding for what is happening in our economy. Obviously, it's a little bit alarming if you haven't seen mobility data before, because basically what this is really suggesting is that these phones in our pockets are also tracking our location, and those locations are being used to basically get a sense for what is our level of activity. And what we saw is that mobility went down considerably in the first and second quarter of this year, but has now really moved back to higher levels. Importantly, things in looking at panel 2, global mobility data, you see situations like grocery and pharmacy activity have improved almost to the point of where they were prior to the pandemic, but people's return to the workplace has largely remained much lower at negative 36%. And the question as we think about the future is what level this will have and what impact this will have on technology, and more importantly on office space and how we think about office space. TSA travel levels have significantly ticked up, and pandemic fatigue has largely set in. So unlike a lot of individuals in various countries such as the UK or parts of Asia where there's tremendous compliance, in the US, many Americans have a hard time listening to authority, and so we expect over 6 million travelers to take the skies on Thanksgiving, which will unfortunately likely have devastating results as it relates to the pandemic. So let's turn to the next page and look at the lockdown by country in the broader economy. What we see on the upper left-hand panel is large European countries in terms of their government response and stringency enforcement. And then we see the effect of those lockdowns on the economy. So looking at the panel on the right, you see that countries like France have had a large economic effect as a result of taking very stringent measures, and they are only exceeded by the UK, who has also experienced very strong stringent measures, which hopefully will keep their individuals safe, but has largely been as the result of continued declines of the economy. Let's turn to page 12, where we can turn to the unemployment effects that this has had on the overall economy. What we see is that the unemployment rate reached an unbelievable 14.5% in April on the panel on the right. And that was an extraordinary increase relative to unemployment that was at historic lows at less than 3.5%. Just to put it in context, 5% is what we define as the frictional unemployment level. What that means is just people looking to switch jobs or maybe make a change in their career path, that level, or people coming into the workforce or people leaving the workforce. Generally, we say if you're at 5% in unemployment, you're really at full employment. And it's pretty incredible to see that we were actually not just 1%, but a full 1.5% below that level heading into the pandemic. And that financial strength, the strength in particular of our financial institutions, is what's allowed us to be in a situation now where we're handling this from a financial standpoint so well, and is allowing the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve Bank to support us in terms of overall economies. However, moving to a 14.7% unemployment rate, which has been unbelievably severe, it's been equally interesting to note the degree to which that unemployment rate was cut in half in August, down to 8.4% as a result of the fact of what I was describing before, where so many of these workers were really laid off temporarily as opposed to permanently. As a result, we do think it will take a series of years to work back to that frictional unemployment level of 5%. But unlike the Great Recession of 2008, where it took a full decade to get back to the same output growth as what we had before, we think in this situation we will see a recovery inside of 3 years. Let's turn to page 16, where we can look at valuations. And valuations is an important consideration because it really speaks to where are we and how do we support these levels of growth. I highlighted before that the technology sector has been extraordinarily valued very highly, in addition to producing very strong earnings. And what the panel on the left shows is that we are currently in the 10th decile. In other words, the most expensive portion of where we could be relative to history in terms of the price we are willing to pay for a dollar of earnings. Why that's so important is because it can cause people to have significant concern that the global stock markets have recovered too much, too fast. But before we draw that conclusion, it's important to note that valuations over periods of time where we have tremendously low levels of inflation are able to support these very high levels of valuation. And that is no more true than the current period of time, because ultimately, as we've had this tremendous technology improvement and unbelievable levels of innovation, which we've seen really across industry, largely represented by the large technology businesses, those effects have largely been deflationary. The average study suggests that the average global consumer has benefited by over $2,500 per year in value from the benefits they've received from their technology, such as Facebook and Amazon and Google, as a result of advertisers actually being the ones that pay for these businesses. And it's beyond this discussion to really have, beyond this presentation, to really have the discussion around the societal impacts of social media and its effects. But one thing is clear, there is an unbelievable economic transfer taking place as the cost of these tremendous technological improvements are largely paid for by advertisers as opposed to users. And as a result, while many people are quick to talk about potential movements that the Trump administration has made in terms of lowering taxes, in terms of improving, stimulating global growth, and that's certainly debatable on both sides, you then have many people moving quickly to pivot from there to say, no, it's actually the central bankers and their ability to keep interest rates low. But before we get too comfortable with that position, the only reason why central banks have been actually keep rates so low is because inflation has largely been invisible. And the invisibility of inflation is the result of the deflationary effects of the tremendous technological growth and productivity improvements that we all have seen across industry writ large. So at the end of the day, it really comes back to Schumter. It's the creative destruction that allowed for the innovation of these technological improvements that have largely caused prices to remain low, which have allowed consumers to enjoy tremendous benefits as if they lived 100 years ago and were multimillionaires, and the everyday consumer, which has allowed that Federal Reserve to keep rates low, which has allowed all sorts of politicians and countries to take credit for things that maybe really goes back to innovation and technological improvement that really deserves all the credit. And how appropriate given the session that we're having here today in this entire forum. So moving to page 18, you see this growth value dynamic playing out, where we have that line up represents the dispersion between growth stocks versus value stocks. If you look at the panel on the right, a lot of the industries we serve, whether it be utilities or energy, have had significant declines relative to the tremendous proliferation of growth of the FANG stocks, as well as information technology, and the degree to which that technology has also spilled over into these various other sectors, which we see so notably in consumer discretionary and consumer services. And you can look no further than Amazon. Is Amazon a technology company or a consumer company? And before we can begin to answer that question, as of yesterday, they are now a pharmaceutical company too. So to what degree do we see the continued proliferation of these large technology companies into other industries? And what effects do we think that technology will have on the broader economy? Let's turn to page 21, where we can, and actually 22, excuse me, where we can look specifically at China. Because as I've mentioned, China has had extraordinary improvements in its economy, and will have a 2% growth rate for the year 2020, followed by a 7.5% growth rate for the year 2021. This has largely been led by extreme investment that the Chinese government has made into their economy. And so in 2021, while we expect strong rebounds in places like Europe, continental Europe, as well as the UK and the US, in China, we don't expect that tremendously strong rebound growth because it's already happening, largely a result of them getting out in front of the virus early, having very significant lockdowns, and then moving forward. But the questions we all have to ask ourselves, both as market participants, but also as social actors, is what is the degree to which there's been a stifling of innovation in China as a result of this as a centrally managed economy. And we can look no further than the pulled IPO of Ant Group and the degree to which that Alibaba may be threatened to be delisted by the US stock exchange as a result of not providing enough disclosure in relation to those businesses. So many times we're left looking at wondering why various investors and market actors are always so focused on the US. What's extraordinary is that the US, prior to 2019, represented 55% of the global economy. So if you put $1 in every single global market, and that represented the size of those markets in relation to one another, 55 cents of your dollar would go to the US. As we sit here today, that's now represented by 65 cents. So we've had a full 10% increase in terms of the US share of global growth relative to what it had in history. And that growth is largely the function of the proliferation of these technology businesses. But when you peel the layers of the onion back, the reason why the US economy is the most invested and largest in the world is because of its financial transparency and its ability to have very strong financial reporting coupled with very supportive and robust legal systems, resulting in tremendous diversity. And when you go into other countries and look to make investments in places like India or China or South Korea, what you find is a very limited diversification set or opportunity set of investments you can make. And as a result, that's why investors continue to return to the US stock market, at least for the time being and for the foreseeable future, in relation to the depth and transparency of its reporting relative to countries like China. Let's turn to page 23 and touch on Brexit for a moment. And I can think back to 2016, where we talked about years like 2019 and 2020 when Brexit was going to take effect. And at the time, the biggest thought as an investor and market actor was that we would see there must be an ability to have tremendous runway to work these things out ahead of any sort of looming deadline. Yet, unbelievably, for all of our friends sitting across the pond, there's tremendous consternation as we move very discernibly into the deadline at the end of this year. And one way or another, we are going to see this secession occur, this separation, and the degree to which certain tax tariffs and negotiations and individual unilateral trade pacts can be worked out is really coming down to the wire. Importantly, we are seeing signs of improvement. While we don't have any resolution on the fisheries industry, which has been largely at impasse in relation to negotiations, we do think there's room for a narrow free trade agreement that will involve some type of no tariff, no quota trade deals prior to the end of the year. But the degree to which that will allow the UK to flourish is largely questioned in terms of those new relationships. President Trump certainly tried to negotiate individually with the UK, but largely there needs to be a multilateral solution here to allow for the soft settling of the UK. And all the while, as a result of the tremendous leadership and efforts that have been taken by Boris Johnson and other members of Parliament to really support the lockdowns, it could not come as a worse time for the UK, given the degree to which the economic contractions have occurred. And so our thoughts remain with our friends in the UK as they look to resolve these issues in the coming months and days ahead, and we'll certainly all be watching. Let's turn to page 24, where we can talk about in a little more detail the US election. As mentioned, we'll have clarity coming into January, and one way or another, we will see President-elect Biden take office on January 20th. This Georgia race will be the focus as it relates to policy. Turning to page 25, we'll see in more detail some of the effects of that impact in terms of the legislative map, with really show this razor-like result where a record number of voters voted via absentee ballot as a result of the pandemic, which largely skewed towards Democrats. So turning to page 26, let's now really shift our attention and focus to an action-oriented plan of what we can anticipate from a Biden administration and how that will affect the industries we serve. What we are likely to see is a resounding pivot in the direction of clean technology and environmental improvements and really decarbonization of the power sector by 2035, a real aiming for 100% of clean energy. This will require certain methane pollution limits and the use of the federal government procurement system to drive towards these pieces. You'll see an increased advance of biofuels and aggressive appliance and building efficiency standards as the administration looks to put things in place via executive order. Turning to page 27, we see the effects that this will have in terms of the how much can be done via executive order versus regulatory action versus congressional action, which, as we talked about before, will rest very much on the Senate. The reality is there is a lot that President Biden can do via executive order, most notably his ability to rejoin the Paris Agreement, blocking new leases on federal land refugees, recertification of California's waiver to implement its fuel economy, environmental justice, the rearming of the EPA, which has largely been hollowed out under President Trump, more lengthy reviews, climate sanctions, and a fossil fuel ban. From a regulatory standpoint, over the next 3 to 12 months, we expect new SEC regulation, wider scope of Clean Waters Act, a new fuel standards economy, a reallocation of illegally granted moves as relates to the efforts that can take place on these private lands, and a reduction of methane flaring. However, it's unclear how much of this will be permanently put in place as opposed to put in place over the next 4 years. So now, with the time I have remaining, I'd like to turn to page 30 and really take you through, from our standpoint, what is the technology impact we assess through various economies. And before I turn to carbonomics, I want to just spend a moment on medical technology, because I know many of you serve the med tech industry. It's important to know from a med tech standpoint that we are seeing from orthotics a very high recovery of the rate of surgeries that we saw prior to the pandemic. We are now at about 100% of normal through Q4. At this moment, we're about 90%, with more knee surgeries taking place than hip surgeries. There's a large arsenal of patients who have certainly put off surgery in 2020. We represent that amount to be about 25%, but that will likely lead to a backlog in the year ahead. And so it's likely to be a very strong 2021, assuming this vaccine can be administered in the med tech space. And so turning to the biggest effect we're likely to have on our energy sector, nothing is going to have a bigger impact in terms of the U.S. economy and or the U.S. election, I should say, importantly, as well as the proliferation of technology than carbonomics. So what is carbonomics? Carbonomics is the net zero carbon emissions affordability and also the flattening of the decarbonization cost curve. That cost curve has two major components to it. It's really focused on renewable energy and the degree to which you can have renewable power, resulting in about a 20% reduction of the cost curve, which we think is largely the result of scale being achieved in renewable power, coupled with clean hydrogen power for those dirty industries or dirty businesses as they're so called, such as heavy transport, heating, and industry. We are able to bring the cost curve down by as much as 30% as a result of clean hydrogen and the effects that it has on those businesses. Historically, though, the big backlog has been the proliferation of technology in its effect, in its throughput, if you will, in allowing for this to occur. But what we are pleased to share is that based on our analysis, for the first time ever in history, renewable power will become the largest area of investment in the year 2021, surpassing oil and gas for literally the first time ever. And that those flood of dollars and the capital efficiencies which come as a result of that improvement are largely in good measure and supportive of this move forward. And so as we think about the degree to which renewable energy and these technologies affect the industries that we all touch and live and work with so severely, it really can be broken into the four main categories on this page. So let's spend some time going through them in detail. First is transportation. And in particular, in transportation, it's things such as fuel cell electronic vehicles, which can be used to alternate the decarbonization solution for transport, as well as shorter refueling time, and importantly, less weight, making them particularly useful in those long-haul situations. It's the improvement of rail by virtue of hydrogen trains, which can be used to decarbonize the rail freight, which is so pervasive in our country. It's hydrogen-based synthetic fuels that can be used in aviation to decarbonize that industry, and given the amount of fuel that is required to power so much of our aviation industry. And then in shipping and marine, a move towards more hydrogen and, importantly, interestingly, an ammonia-based solution that allows for the domestic shipping also occurring in a decarbonized way. Shifting from transportation to power generation, it's the full decarbonization of power generation that is likely to occur. And energy storage has historically always been the challenge in this space, but by virtue of additional capacity in terms of battery use and life, as well as storage, that is all likely set to continue to improve as we move forward. And so just looking at the transportation field, we feel that the ability of the clean ammonia run ships is likely to have the biggest effect, coupled with the long haul, clean hydrogen for long haul trips will have the biggest effect on that cost curve as we look to take down the additional costs. Within power generation, it's really going to be the seasonal storage and ability of having certain uptakes from the renewable space. Turning from the actual transportation and power industry to buildings, it's the LED certification of buildings, the ability to have hydrogen renewable electricity run heat pumps in two key areas, both in terms of its commercial use as well as retrofits and the development of those retrofits. It's things as simple as LED lighting, insulation, and the use of smart thermostats to be able to modulate temperature control. And so ultimately the cost curve benefits will come from clean hydrogen, including the switching from gas boilers to hydrogen boilers, and the ability of heat pumps to run on renewable energy. Finally, with all this industry production, it's the proliferation of industry waste and the treatment of that waste, which is so critical. 40% of emissions that we see are associated with the use of energy from industrial production. And so the ability to switch from coal to natural gas, or in some cases biomass, will have a discernible effect on our ability to move forward in this direction. Even things as simple as cement, which have process emissions of 60%, can be reduced by reducing the ratio of clinker to be able to allow for a greater, cleaner production of cement. In iron and steel, we see a switch from the BOF processes to natural gas, which will likely have a similar effect. And in petrochemicals, the use of clean hydrogen that could really aid in the decarbonization of this process. From an efficiency standpoint, increasing recycling, promoting recycling, and the efficiency that can be gained from improvement in recycling programs, all of which will show the way to how we can reduce industry waste. And so this full move from hydrogen and decarbonization of iron and steel, as well as raw materials, and certainly petrochemicals, will have a discernible effect. And while this is all occurring, we have a tremendous movement in agriculture, moving from farm to fork, as they say, in the movement of agriculture and the efficiency of methane production, which is also driving improvement. So as we step back and we look at these hard industries, these big industries, which have been so reluctant initially to sort of pivot to change, we see a combination of the flood of capital supported by policies that are now becoming more widely acceptable and pervasive. And finally, the deflationary effects of the innovation of technology, all coming back to Shumpter. And what we find is that the future, while remaining uncertain, is bright for the degree to which technological innovation will really shape not just all industries and businesses, and not just our own lives, but most notably the carbonomics and the movement down of the carbon cost curve. And so with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Much appreciated. We do have a couple questions in here. The first one comes from Jeff Patterson from ASME. He says, Ryan, you mentioned the importance of government support for furloughed workers. What is your prediction for when a second stimulus package will be approved by Congress and signed by whoever is president at that time? That is, do you think Congress will pass this legislation before Biden takes office?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. Prior to the election, we were estimating that we would see a package as large as $2 trillion to really support workers. And there was a potential that they would be able to even combine infrastructure spending with with government support in relation to this package. What we found, though, is that as a result of the uncertain and split Congress, that package is likely now only to be $1 trillion. As recently as yesterday, the Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer sent an email, or I should say sent a letter to Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, asking for renewed talks. And so we're not in the business of really being able to pinpoint when a stimulus package will take hold, but we do think that that stimulus package will now be $1 trillion as opposed to $2 trillion. And the timing of that package is likely to be sometime either during this lame duck session or certainly in Q1. I think the most important point is notwithstanding the jawboning that we're seeing occur in our U.S. political system at the moment, we still have about a 50% probability of seeing some type of package, although largely diminutive relative to what we anticipated. It's hard to think of $1 trillion as diminutive, occurring potentially at the end of this year, and if not, then certainly in the first quarter. And from a market standpoint, the market's main focus is just that a package gets done. Obviously, from everyday households, the sooner that package gets done, the better. But from an overall financial stability standpoint, as long as it's done sometime between the lame duck Congress and in early Q1, then it will largely allow for the continued stimulative benefits of the recovery. In the meantime, the most important thing is going to be the continued proliferation of mask wearing, social distancing, and other measures to really keep people safe, which will really dictate the near-term trajectory of the U.S. economy.
Okay, Ryan, thank you so much. And thank you, Jeff, for the question. We have one more question. It's been asked by a guest of the forum. What would be the impact of price earnings valuation that you said is sustainable in a low inflation environment if there is a spike in inflation, perhaps because of government debt-fueled spending?
Great question. So for the first time in history, or first time since in the post-World War II period, in 2021, we're going to see the size of our fiscal deficit exceed US GDP. And that issue in relation to how we think about long-term trends is a very concerning one. However, at this unbelievable expansion of federal debt, we also are paying 30% less than what we normally would pay to service that debt. And so under Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, what we've seen is a proliferation of issuance of 30-year Treasury instruments, really terming out our debt in long-term nature, much like if you were an individual and you have your own mortgage and you have a floating rate mortgage, and then you swap that mortgage with the same amount of debt for a fixed 30-year mortgage at a lower rate, you lock in that cost savings for the foreseeable future. So what we've seen, both in terms of businesses, industry, and governments, is the proliferation of debt at very, very low interest rates. And therefore, the debt service, or the interest payments we have to pay to service that debt, is likely to remain unbelievably low relative to history for a long period of time. Ultimately, the increase of inflation is a function of the output gap as well as where we fall from a productivity standpoint. And what we clearly have seen is that, for reasons I've highlighted, the technological innovation has created a bigger output gap and created more productivity. So inflation is not something we see emerging on the scene for a number of years. As a result, the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve Bank are all likely to keep interest rates not only low, but likely not even to touch raising rates until the year 2025. So 5 years from now, which is hard to fathom. As a result, the valuations we see in the stock market are generally supportive. This is not meant to be a forward-looking statement or an investment recommendation, but the valuations we see are largely supportive of this very low level of inflation and will largely result in a continued expansion of economic growth, both in terms of the degree to which we can afford to pay for these businesses at these prices, but also the ability of the businesses to go out and borrow for them to be able to then expand. So just like in the Great Recession of 2008 or deep in the recession of what we experienced in March and April of this year, the vicious cycles of the economy and the gears turning are right now moving in more of a virtuous circle where the combination of low inflation, high technological improvement, low debt service is all creating an environment for expansion that won't be without a level of volatility, but is likely to persist into the foreseeable future.
Okay, Ryan, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for the questions. We do have a couple more questions, but we're going to take those offline with respect to time. Ryan, your topic was, your presentation was fantastic and very relevant to the community that is attending today. I think there was a lot of great information, and thank you very much for volunteering your time with us this morning. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jim. And in addition to the presentation I made available, I will also send out our Carbonomics research report, which goes into great detail on the issues I covered at the end. So for any of you touching the energy industry, you can feel free to look at that presentation as well, which I hope is as easy to follow and read as this presentation here was today. Thank you so much for all of your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. Now we have our second keynote speaker this morning, and that is Tatiana Khayrullina. And as I mentioned earlier, she's the Director and Lead Analyst for Scientific and Technical Solutions at Outsell Incorporated. Tatiana, take it away, and thank you for your time again.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this forum. So yes, I'm the Director and Lead Analyst for the Scientific and Technical Solutions at Outsell, which means I'm tracking the information data and analytics industry in terms of digital publishing of standards and digital publishing of scholarly communications papers. So a lot of my examples and a lot of the information in this talk will come from that segment of the information data and analytics industry. And my talk is titled Publishing for Optimists, which I was hoping to bring a note of humor, but also to reflect on the dramatic and systemic change that the industry is undergoing. Truly, it's comparable in the scale, in the scope, and the space, and the pace to the original Gutenberg revolution. If you think of it, the industry has always depended on some sort of technology, and actually, it was an invention that prompted the industry into existence in the first place. So now we're living through another tremendous change that the industry is going through. The change that is driven by a variety of trends, of which I picked only the top three. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So multiple trends are driving the change, of course, but the top three, as the most relevant, I think, to the topic that we have on the table today, are the following. Commoditization of content, that really means that publishing content digitally and selling access to content is an increasingly less and less compelling business model for publishers. There are multiple reasons for that. One of the big ones is the advancement of open access, which means the push to make scientific research published through, funded through public funds, publicly available to everyone. Another is the normalization of sharing of scientific output through social networks like ResearchGate. A third one is the willingness of users to forego subscriptions. That could potentially spill out into the standard space as well. And I'm talking about the leading users like the University of California foregoing subscriptions with the leading publishers like Elsevier, a really groundbreaking change that happened last year. And finally, proliferation of preprints or alternative content. And alternative, I mean alternative to the the established format of a peer-reviewed article in scientific communications. So all that is are indications of the fact that the commoditization content is underway, it's occurring. The second big trend, and highly relevant, of course, to our topic on hand, is the technological advancement. Again, the topic itself is enormous, it's huge, but what we need to keep in mind is, most importantly, is there is no more paper. the format that was so resilient, that has served us so well for 600 years, is finally changing. So the scientists of the 21st century are no longer publishing in the way the scientists in the 17th century were publishing. And even though we're still thinking in terms of articles and pages and chapters and books, the truth is that we're relying more and more on data, on code, on computational power, on cheap and reliable internet like today. And that is all leading to the irreversible path to changing the way research is published and disseminated. Another aspect of technological advancement is, of course, the availability of technology to all players in the market. And artificial intelligence is a great example of that. It has dominated the headlines in 2019, in 2020, probably keep dominating it in 2021. There's a great reason for that, because it lends itself so well for so many processes and to the solution of so many pain points in the publishing industry. And now we're at a point at the junction where the adoption can become mainstream. Finally, I mentioned alternative content before. That actually includes anything that is not a peer-reviewed article, and that could be a video, that could be remote, anything that promotes and supports remote collaboration. It could be marketing technologies that publishers are compelled to implement to bring a variety of solutions to market and to meet their goals and to stay competitive. And in order to stay competitive, of course, they have to keep meeting user expectations, and that keeps being a challenge to them. And again, this is a huge topic in itself. What does meeting user expectations actually mean? Means different things to different publishers. But important points to keep in mind are again the following. First of all, there are demographic changes that we're living through. People that were born in 2002 entered universities this year as freshmen. They're bringing a completely different perception of what consumption of information is, how fast it should occur, through which devices, whether or not it should be reading or watching a video. The way they see themselves as actors in this marketplace is completely different from people with different background and people of different age. So this is a generation that will reshape the industry, keep reshaping the industry as consumers, as researchers, as young engineers, readers of standards in the coming 5 to 10 years. We are also, all of us are more sophisticated users of digital content. We're really experienced in using the digital marketplace, the wider commercial digital marketplace. It's not only information, but it's anything else. Every interaction that we have with the wider commercial marketplace teaches us the way things should be. And if we see them different when we interact with the digital publishing industry, the question is why? So that's another expectation that publishers need to meet. Ways in which we process information are also changing. Essentially, people read less and less. At the same time, scientists may need to compare hundreds of methodologies in a matter of minutes or hours really fast in order to find the one that would be working for them. They need access to evidential data that they could reuse instantly and via a global remote collaboration. And this evidential data could be buried somewhere in the conference proceedings. So seamless, secure access to a broad array of content is really gaining in significance. Also, less formal content is gaining ground, such as blogs and reviews and annotations and nuggets of micro-publishing. So anything that really gets captured in the digital marketplace and digital publishing marketplace that wasn't deemed so important and relevant maybe several years ago is now coming to the forefront. Besides, researchers do not only write, they speak, they present, they debate, they attend virtual conferences such as this forum. And publishers need to support them as participants in this larger collaboration economy at all stages of their careers. So you see really the task of meeting user expectations is so multifaceted and will mean different things to different publishers. And there is one final element to it, and that's mission alignment in terms of open access. That's very key to the majority of researchers, and very important for publishers to keep relevant and keep competitive. So faced with at least these top trends and many other moving parts in the industry, publishers are really challenged to answer the question, what business am I in? Can we move to the next slide, please? So what business am I in, and what should I be doing to stay relevant and to continue to deliver value to my constituents? And largely, again, in different shapes and forms, but they come up with these three seemingly simple answers. So I will continue to provide analytical insights. I will not provide reference content. I will facilitate discovery, whatever that means to the researchers in my discipline. And finally, and very importantly, I will support open science. Definitely, technology plays a role in fulfilling this mission. And publishers need their tools and specific technologies to be successful. If we could go to the next slide, please. So if the requirement is to find exactly the information that the researcher is looking for, that really means that top-class metadata and all the various applications that it will power, like natural language searching, like concept-based inquiry, like semantic fingerprinting or effective ontologies, is really far more important than the redundant formats, such as books and articles or journals and the like, that the industry is still discussing. Another important tool or suite of technologies that publishers need to be thinking about is automated workflows. These are important because workflow automation comes to the forefront as publishers strive to eliminate anything that really distracts the researcher from doing the research, to eliminate the components of researcher workflow that are they're necessary but can be automated, and they're not really part of the value that the researcher brings to the world. Manuscript submission process is a great example of that. Necessary components, of course, researchers have to submit their work to be published. A lot of that is not actual research, but takes a lot of time. So automated workflow is very important for publishers to pay attention to. And finally, open science translates into trusted collaborative environment, into a lot of transparency, and into recognition of every and each contribution to the research process, to the knowledge creation process that all researchers make. That also means valuing all means of implementing and recording discovery. That means that's increasingly happening in real time. And also it means that content other than text needs to be accepted as a bona fide research artifact. That all means open science. So building trusted collaborative environments that have all these components is also a priority for publishers. If we go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit more about specific examples of how the mission supported by the tools and technologies that I've just mentioned translates into use cases or success stories. And in picking those examples, I was trying to look for use cases and applications that could have a lasting effect on the industry. Because it's true that digital publishing sees a lot of new entrants on a monthly basis. You see new names. Sometimes they take years and years to make an impact. But sometimes there are true success stories that scale up really quickly and have the potential to keep reshaping the industry. So these are the stories that I was looking for as I was looking for examples for this talk. Okay, in terms of alternative content, like I said, alternative anything that's not a printed peer-reviewed article. In particular, these two young companies are making interesting changes to the industry, and they're both supporting conferences and conference proceedings as alternative content, and they're both making conference proceedings discoverable and reusable. And why conference proceedings are so important is that they are the foray for dissemination of early ideas. They're the means of disseminating early research, and it's early research that feeds into the accelerated discovery and accelerated knowledge creation. Conferences have struggled with formats that would be searchable, citable, and reusable for years and years. And in many cases, evidential data would be buried in conference proceedings. So these two companies are making determined efforts to close the gap around conferences. They started with posters, especially Mauricia. They started with posters and presentations, and they've enriched them with metadata and made them discoverable. Of course, with the onset of the pandemic, conferences were pushed into the virtual environment, which ironically was a boost for both of them, especially for Underline, who was only formed in early 2020. So it was kind of timely. Underline is even more interesting because they take video content and not only do they make it searchable and citable, they subtitle it in multiple languages. They make it easily discoverable. In other words, they really bring the proceedings of such conferences into the libraries. So researchers would be looking for a specific data point, and it's very likely that they will find it not in a scientific article, but in the conference proceedings. That's a huge step forward. If we could go to the next slide, please. Disambiguation. In the scholarly communications, that's an important pain point to resolve. And there are many reasons for that. Again, they have to do with open science, and they have to do with the modern research process in general, where it's not uncommon for dozens of researchers to collaborate on one single research paper, especially in disciplines like computer science. A lot of these researchers would come from different parts of the world, and many of them would share a common last name. It's a real problem to distinguish between all these people, but it's also absolutely necessary in support of open science to make sure that every single contribution is recorded, is paid attention to, and every single contributor gets their credit in their scientific career for their contribution. That would promote science, of course, because that would promote a participation in such project. So what Artifacts AI is doing, they're using blockchain for the real-time recognition of scientific research. That's kind of the high-level description. What they started with is really granular, meticulous metadata that allows scientists to record what exactly was it that they contributed to a shared output. And it could be a revision of code. It could be a portion of peer review. They could be the principal author, and the list goes on and on and on. So they started with this meticulous metadata where the scientists sort of pick from the menu that is a lot richer than the typical menu that you get in the manuscript submission process. And then this gets recorded in a blockchain. So whatever research is submitted, whatever contribution is recorded, it's protected, it's in the mutable record. It works like any other blockchain record. So that's one example. IRIS is doing very similar. It's a very similar project, but have a different mission. They want to change the process of science creation altogether. They're taking this blockchain approach where every step is recorded, and they're trying to eliminate the need for research being published at all. So it's sort of creating this digital data lake of existing research where every piece is securely recorded and attributed, and they're encouraging researchers to contribute. Very similar technologies, very different missions. One is totally kind of within the existing infrastructure of digital publishing. The other sees itself more of a revolutionary trying to break it up. Interesting to look at, interesting to see the progress. I have to say that Artifacts slowly but surely gaining ground and gaining more and more adoption in the scholarly communications industry, both with the publishers and with the universities. So we'll see how IRIS will do. Next slide, please. Of course, we could not avoid the topic of artificial intelligence and STM. And just as a quick reminder, STM stands for scientific, technical, and medical, and really it's kind of a synonym for scientific communications in general, the way we see it at Outsell. So when artificial intelligence becomes actually the way researchers read other people's research, things will get really interesting, but we're not there yet. We probably won't be for a few years yet. However, artificial intelligence does enjoy a high degree of adoption in STM. At Outsell, we noticed a correlation of the level of digital maturity of the industry in general with the ability of the industry to adopt AI. And finally, almost 80% of revenues in ASTM come from digital content and digital solutions, and that has been in place for years already. So digital maturity means that publishers and publishing service companies have been doing digitization, text enrichment, and keyword development for more than 3 decades. So the industry is well prepared for adoption of AI. And there's been this virtuous cycle between publishers and partners, and supported in part by common XML vocabularies. So they have developed and implemented common standards, like the journal article tag suite for document markup, and key mechanisms for content identification and findings such as digital object identifier and ORCID ID for individual researchers. So taken together, these give STM publishers a rich and widely used content supply that AI technologies can leverage. And it is being leveraged in 3 distinct categories: content creation, content curation, and content delivery. Although really, if we look at the level of adoption under each category, we should really flip on its head, because content delivery is the leading one. But let's look at them individually. Content creation, really what it means, it could be expert matching, where matching authors with peer reviewers, or matching authors with journals that might want to publish their research in, can be done with the help of technologies. It sounds simple, but it's not, because every single piece of research is really a very, very niche, very narrow set of data points. And they have to be published in a journal that would be optimal for it, and there are thousands of them. And the same goes for peer reviewers. It's other scientists who look at this work, and you really need to match the qualifications of the researcher, the objective of their studies, with the qualifications of the peer reviewer. It's not an easy task. And it's part of the value that publishers bring to the scientific communications, and it can be automated once you have the related databases. So expert matching is something that AI can do for publishers. Plagiarism detection, that's pretty self-explanatory, and of course it can be done with the help of AI that can scan vast universe of text in seconds to see if there is any rephrasing of plagiarism. Text generation is something new. Again, we have a couple of examples of early success stories, both from Spring and Nature. Spring and Nature used artificial intelligence in April 2019 to generate a book on current research on lithium-ion batteries. And early in the COVID-19 pandemic, they used the same technology to generate a snapshot of its research into the virus. So they're sort of looking into that. That's not, of course, their mainstream technology. That's not what they use on a daily basis. But they've proven that it can be done. Besides that, an advanced example, authors can also benefit from artificial intelligence for managing the best data sources for reuse while publishers validate research sources. And also, artificial intelligence can be used to improve the already written text in terms of, in terms of the quality of the language, edited for clarity, and academic language usage, something that has been done again by peer reviewers and editors manually. So now at least part of it can be outsourced. Can we go to the next slide, please? Content curation, abstracting and indexing, a very important key core of the value that the scholarly communications industry brings to the discovery of knowledge and knowledge creation. AI algorithms can extract named entities and domain-specific concepts using semantic enhancements, such as controlled vocabularies or taxonomies that bring domain terms into context. Such workflows typically apply conceptual XML tagging using domain-specific markup languages. Since I mentioned domain-specific 3 times already in these 2 short sentences, abstracting and indexing cannot be outsourced to the machine at the moment completely. It's always a machine and human collaboration. It's a meticulous process of matching content in narrow domains, and there are no trained algorithms that do it perfectly yet. So they always have to be supervised by a human, or rather expert curation should be the first step. But abstraction and indexing is definitely on the list of what AI could potentially do for the industry, and the industry is moving in that direction and moving very fast. AI can develop controlled vocabularies and taxonomies and help with disambiguation, with resolving synonyms, homographs, and other linguistic ambiguities that will also potential and aid discovery. And finally, ontology development. Published data optimized for cross-silo and cross-vocabulary searches is the way to go. Ability to search across content produced by different publishers, potentially in different languages, is really what science is looking for to aid discovery. It is not possible without common ontologies. So AI can aid with ontology development. And the example I'm using here is Elsevier and SciByte. SciByte is a recent acquisition by Elsevier. Elsevier is a leading publisher, scientific publisher. It's interesting because SciByte is precisely well-versed in ontology development for the life sciences. So it has been a vendor for Elsevier or a technology enabler for Elsevier and other publishers and other market players. And Elsevier decided to bring it in-house, which demonstrates the value that ontology development holds for the future of this industry, and also the value of the ability to connect content from various publishers, different publishers, and enable cross-publisher search. And finally, we have content delivery. Needle in a haystack. It's when you look for something, you look for something and you really don't have the keyword. That's the best example of when AI can come to the rescue. Content discovery is the most widespread use of AI currently. This is in part because of its importance, but also because search technology is more mature and benefits from substantial investment over time, the one that I mentioned before. And the investment not only from industry actors like Elsevier, but also from the big tech companies like Google and Microsoft, and publishers themselves, of course, and their discovery partners, such as Clarivate. So in other words, publishers have been at it for decades now. So now it's at a stage where both they have the metadata and the technology that they can bring together and enable content discovery. So get away from keywords and go to semantic search, go to serendipitous discovery, which is one instance that they described to me like a giant cocktail party when topics just come up together serendipitously, and you would not know that they are related, but AI would bring it to your attention, which is really wonderful. Recommendation engines. With the deeper understanding of the meaning and interrelations among published articles and other materials will come the ability to create meaningful links within and across content collections. Again, something that humans cannot do at the moment. And the example here that has the potential to reshape the industry is Semantic Scholar. It is an AI search engine for scientific journal articles, and it uses machine learning, and it's able to build richer semantic analysis, include the extraction of relevant figures, entities, and venues. Semantic Scholar is built and maintained by Allen Institute for AI, and it's continually ingesting content from various publishers. That's key. It's a cross-publisher engine. So the corpus that it's using is growing. At the time of writing, it had more than 173 million papers, and it offers functionalities such as prioritized results, popularity metrics, identification of data sets and methods, and others. So really, it's becoming to play a key role in content discovery. It's also collaborating with technology platforms, such as publishing platforms that serve hundreds of publishers. So like I said, its footprint is growing, and it really has the ability to make an impact on the industry. We can move to the next slide. How are we doing for time?
I think Tatiana, maybe two minutes or so.
Okay, then we can actually, okay, I'll make a couple of comments here. So I wanted to bring a few examples from the wider data and information industry, and the wider, that's the other segments that Outsell is tracking, which is finance, legal, education, and MarTech. and they're all different. They all have different objectives, of course, different timelines and different resources, frankly speaking. But interestingly enough, so they kind of fall down the lines of the objectives and the pain points of the current industries. So education, one of the sectors that was so tremendously impacted by the pandemic, had to change overnight, literally overnight, move into virtual overnight. So it has seen projects brought to the marketplace within a couple of weeks, and that's why Coursera is on the list. Coursera offered a solution for institutions, but they were using their hundreds and hundreds of courses for their online instruction. They offered to match them with their curricula, something that manually would have taken months, if not years of time. They were able to produce a related tool in a couple of weeks, and they've seen a tremendous rate of adoption. MarTech is seeing a lot of interest in community platforms, increased interest in community platforms. Legal is concentrating on smart contracts and the ability to extract data buried in documents in legal libraries. Finance is focusing more on identity match and fraud prevention. They're using blockchain and they're using AI as well. And we see that happen globally. It's not only North America. So the examples for finance I have here, they're actually happening in Switzerland. And of course, education is global and becoming even more so. And finally, I have my last slide for essential actions. Thank you. So we only have a few essential actions for companies that are looking to implement any innovative technology. Really, it doesn't have to be AI, but any innovative technology. And the first action is don't overpromise. For many people, for many stakeholders in your organization, a particular technology could still be a black box, and hype around it would sound reasonable, and in many cases it's not. So managing user expectations is very important, as is identifying and targeting high-value use cases. Publishers that have been successful in implementing artificial intelligence, they've pinpointed use cases within their organizations where they could really measure the outcome. Often it's their own productivity, it wasn't customer facing. Looking for projects like that and trying to implement them first would really pave the way for a larger adoption. Leverage what the industry is doing and try to differentiate based on that. And this is where I wanted to bring to your attention again the fact that the ASTM industry managed to develop common standards and a lot of shared vocabularies that hugely enabled adoption of new technologies across the industry. They kind of bounce off each other, feed off each other. And finally, as with many other things, we're agile. Agile software development has taken hold for many reasons, but a key one is the ability of organizations to implement smaller projects really, really well. So start small, and once you've built something of value, keep refining incrementally. Especially do this if the organization is struggling, trying to battle economic headwinds, and most of our organizations are these days. We've just heard from Ryan. So that was our last essential action, and I would like to open for questions.
Great, Tatiana, thank you so much for such an impressive and relevant presentation for this community. I think that we could probably have another hour of information coming from you that we could discuss with the participants on the channel. We have a few minutes. I can ask, probably we have time for 2 questions. And the first question, Tatiana, comes from Michael Merker. Thank you, Michael, for your question, and good to see you participating in the forum. The question is, do you project that the commoditization of content will drive down margins for traditional content aggregators?
We predict that commoditization of content will drive down margins for all market actors, and for traditional content aggregators, definitely. And there are many kind of headwinds they're facing, not just the ones that I've just mentioned, right? Open access and informal sharing. The ability of large players to forgo subscriptions is a troubling one. I would actually highlight it as the leading reason why commoditization of content is such a threat. Because they really have the means and the technology to either procure the content through other channels or to forgo kind of the traditional way of procuring the content altogether. They have the influence over large thousands of students and researchers and other professionals. And they have the ability to invest into these alternative channels. So yes, I think among all market actors, aggregators are probably the most challenged by this commoditization of content trend. So the margins will come down.
Great, thank you for that answer, Tatiana. I think we have time for one more question before we go to break at 10:10. But we have another question. Can you talk a bit about the ROI or value of meticulous metadata?
Oh, the ROI. We talk about that a lot at Outsell. I think in every single weekly analytical article that I write, I would mention data governance. Hard to put a value on it in terms of numbers. However, we do believe that meticulous data governance, meticulous metadata is a strategic asset these days. It wasn't seen as such several years ago. It was just something that you do internally, they would do internally, and it would have, okay, that maybe, facilitate your internal processes a little bit, make life a little bit easier. But now, not having meticulous metadata is a threat to the entire organization. The ability to enable large-scale data mining is really kind of a very high-level way of where publishers are headed overall in the future, and large-scale data mining is impossible without good metadata. So our advice to companies that are thinking about what should I do with AI, what should I do about innovative technologies in general, is always look at what you already have on hand, look at your own data, and think of ways to improve metadata first. Before you start thinking about partnerships, before you start thinking about bringing anything innovative in-house or buying, building or something, that's usually what people start thinking about. This is not the first step. The first step is to clean up whatever you have in-house and make sure your metadata works. ROI, like I said, I cannot give you a number. I'm sure it will be there. It will not be, it's not a fast process though. Again, we mentioned that it took 3 decades for the ASTM industry to get to a point where they can now implement AI in 2 weeks. Great, but it did take the 3 decades of creating the metadata, of making sure the links are in place, the content channels are in place, and now they are in a position to take what's available and start building new products.